Hi everyone, welcome to our graphing tutorial. Excel has a lot of features and functions to edit and modify your graphs, many of which are not intuitive to find. So I'm going to help you find those features, and I'm going to point out some common errors students make and how to fix them. So let's start off simple by selecting the graph type. So we're going to highlight our cells and then insert the scatter plot. You always want to choose the scatter plot. We don't want to be adding these like extra lines things. We just want to use the scatter plot. We don't want anything that has a connect the dot kind of look. We're not going to be analyzing these squiggly lines here. Anything that you put on the graph, there must be a purpose for that thing to be there. So we're just going to start with the scatter plot. Now let's add on some missing elements. So we're going to go here, this little plus sign, to add chart elements. And then we're going to add axes titles, and we're going to add the trend line. Sometimes when you create a graph, Excel will give you a legend. Don't keep the legend unless it is necessary to use it. So if you only have one data set that you're graphing, then you don't need to use a legend. So on sheet 2 is an example of where you would use a legend. So on sheet 2, we're comparing velocities between two different cars. In the graph on the right, we can see that there's two trend lines have been added to this graph. And then when we add these trend lines, Excel put an item in the legend for each of those trend lines. I would say that these are not necessary and that they should be removed because one should be able to look at this graph and be able to understand that this blue line is associated to the data that is in blue and that the orange line is for the orange dots. So again, in the effort to reduce any clutter or anything that's unnecessary, we're going to delete these unnecessary parts of the legend. So be careful though that when you select your legend, you're not just going to delete your legend. So make sure you just select that one part of the legend that you want to delete. And then sometimes when you look at research papers, they rarely have the legend at the bottom of the graph. It's usually off to the right, or sometimes it will be overlapping the graph. So if we go here, select the legend, and then select this part of the options panel, we can uncheck this, and then the legend will be overlapping the graph. And then we can move the legend so that it's not overlapping our actual data points. And then to make it look a bit better, because we don't want the grid lines to be kind of going through our legend, it'll look better if we actually give it a solid fill. And now we can see that it has a solid fill of white, but it just looks a little odd without any borders. So then we'll add a solid border to that legend. So back to sheet 1, our axes titles need to be given proper titles. So we're going to title them the same as our column headings from our table. So on our x-axis, we're going to put time, and make sure you always include the units that your that axis is in. So we're going to have seconds for time, and then we're going to have velocity in meters per second. Now this is data that I've made up for the purpose of this example. So there's no extra context to be able to give the graph title proper title. So I've kind of pre-made this title ahead of time, just kind of making up a hypothetical scenario where we would have this set of data. So we're recording the velocity of a car as it accelerates on a steep incline for 4 minutes. So I know in the past, you may have been taught that saying a graph title of time versus velocity is an acceptable title, but the higher up in post-secondary you get, the less acceptable that sort of title is going to be. Similar to your table titles, your graph titles should be a bit descriptive of the data that's being shown in the graph. Also note that whenever you include a number in your title, you should type it out fully rather than just putting the numerical digit. When you insert a trend line, you will often need to add the equation of the trend line. In the past, students would do this process by hand where they select 2 dots on the trend line and then do the equation y2 minus y1 divided by x2 minus x1. Don't bother with that. There is a much easier way to get the equation and the slope. So I'm going to select the trend line, or actually we can right click, format trend line, and then make sure that we have this icon selected, and then we can scroll down and then display equation on chart. I often notice that some people like to put the r squared value on the chart. You are not taught what the r squared value is, and so you're not expected to know what it is, and it's really not necessary to put in our graphs. So if you don't know what it's for, and if you're not going to use the r squared value for your analysis, just leave the r squared value out of your graph. So the main reason why we include the equation on our graph is so that we can get the slope from the equation. Now this is something that you're going to be used again in like chemistry, biology, and physics, where when you go to make a graph, you're often going to need to get the slope from your graph to further analyze your data. So here we have our value of our slope here is 0.0463. That is actually the value of our acceleration. So because we have the change of velocity over change in time, that gives us acceleration. So this is an example of why we would include the equation in our graphs. Now, say you have to convert your values or you have to do a calculation on your raw data and you end up with a second column like column B here. And you need to graph column B against time. You can't select the 2 columns by highlighting it. So what you're going to have to do is highlight your first column and then hold down Control while you highlight your second column, and then you can insert your plot. Here is some data based on a titration of an acid with a base. You can see that the data points don't actually fill the entire chart. They occupy about a third of the space of the chart. So we're going to need to edit the axes so that all the data points can fill from like one corner to the other corner. So first we'll do the x-axis. So we'll select the x-axis. And then right now it's only got the fill end line options open. So we'll need to select axes options and then more axes options. There we go. And then we have the minimum and maximum bounds here. So right now the minimum bound is -3. You can see it's -3 here, and the maximum is 22. And so the maximum is 22. So we want to change the -3 to 0. So we'll just change that to 0. And then the graph has changed accordingly. And then for some reason Excel has automatically edited the maximum to better fill it. So we can leave it like that. And so then to edit the y-axis, we'll select the y-axis and it's still on this option. So the minimum bound is at 0, but let's change it to 4 so that it fills it a bit better. And then the maximum, let's choose 11. So now that our data points are filling the chart, I just wanted to point out that you can also change how frequent you have major grid lines. So right now it's every 2 units, but you can change it so it's, say, every 5 units. 5 units for this graph is not ideal, so let's just go ahead and change it back to 2. And then what you can also do is to add minor grid lines. And that will help us later on when we go to interpolate on our graph line. Some graphs cannot use a normal trend line, so you'll need to draw a curve. First, make sure that your graph is selected, because if you don't do that and you go to try to insert a shape, so let's insert this line over here on the graph just to serve an example. So we've drawn this line on the graph, but that line is actually not on the graph. That line is drawn on the Excel page. So to make sure that your drawings are drawn on the graph, make sure that your graph is selected before you insert your object. So we're going to insert, and we're going to add a curve, and then you're going to click on points on your graph, and then it will add the curve according to the points that you give it, and then double click at the very end. And then another thing that you can do, if you screw up your data points, you don't have to delete your curve and then start all over again. You can edit your points. So it will show all the points that we have added to create this curve, and you're able to reposition your points. But not only that, you're also able to use these white boxes to determine how strong that straight line is. So if you were to extend this really far, it's going to create a very straight line for a long distance. Or if you just want to have a short straight portion, you can make that happen. But I just want to kind of give it a little bit more smoothness. And then, and then you can also change the angle by using these white squares to edit it. So, okay, that looks better. So now we need to interpolate. For this graph, we'll need to find about the halfway point between where these sort of like plateau areas are. And I think it's about 7.5. So we're going to need to add a straight line. And so this is one of the things that I like to have the minor grid lines for, is because when you go to draw a line, you can use them as kind of like a guideline as to how straight your drawn line is. If you find you're having difficulties pinpointing it, you can zoom in by going here and zooming in on that spot. And I think it's fairly decently straight. And so, what is going on here? Okay, there we go. And so now with that line is drawn, we can insert our next line. And Excel will give you a little dot where you can start from, and then you can make your line straight down from there. So now that your graph is complete, you'll need to insert it into your lab report. I have seen some people take screenshots of their whole Excel page and then inserted that into their Word document. Or I've seen people take photographs of their graph on their phone and then insert it on their Word document. Please don't be doing that. You'll definitely be losing marks in university if you try to do that sort of thing. What you're going to need to do is to copy and then go to your assignment. No, we don't want that. There we go. And then you can paste it in various ways. So if you paste it using your very first option, you'll then be able to edit your chart in Word. But another way that you can paste your graph is to paste it as a picture. And then it is now a picture, but so you can't edit anything about the graph, but you can edit it as it were a photo.